All right, thank you, Elaine. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's Tech Tips and Tricks. I wanted to jump into a subject that I don't think gets as much exposure as it should with the WatchGuard appliances we have out there. We don't have a lot of people doing actual Firecluster. Firecluster, why and how is our topic for today. And as we jump into this, we'll spend a little bit of time at the beginning going through some PowerPoints just to give you some background, some information that you'll need to have to do this. So as we start with this, first thing we're going to talk about what is a Firecluster, why you would want to do a Firecluster, the different types of Firecluster that are available, the requirements to do that, what happens with failover, how those fail over, and then we'll actually get in and do a live demo and do a demo of how to set this up and configure it. So we'll do the few PowerPoints at the beginning, and again, please make sure if you guys do have any questions as we go, make sure you enter them into the chat box or into the questions box, and we'll make sure we get back to you with those questions as quickly as we can. So right off the bat, what is a Firecluster? Firecluster is a pair of XTM devices configured to provide network redundancy and improved scalability. Basically, if you look at our diagram, it gives us a way to do fault tolerance and failover on the firewalls. Depending on which model of box you're using, you might have the possibility of having just like a single power supply in that box. Some of the higher end units do have redundant power supplies, but no matter what we do, the hardware is always going to be prone to failure, whether it's from a lightning strike or short circuit on a motherboard. Hardware does fail periodically, unfortunately. In a perfect world, it wouldn't, but when we get there, we'll all be out of jobs, right? So with that, with the diagram here, what I'm basically showing is we've got a connection to the internet, we've got a switch sitting on the outside of our firewalls, we've got two firewalls clustered together, and then those are both connected into our internal networks, both our trusted and our optional network. So for redundancy purposes, if any of one of the boxes goes down, the other box will take over and keep those connections alive and active. So why would you want a Firecluster? Number one thing, biggest piece of this, and I guess I really should have made it a bullet point right at the top here, is redundancy. For any one of these reasons that you see here, if you need redundancy on your internet connection, if you've got a big internet presence, if you've got a large employee base, if access to the internet is a major part of your business, if you're a CPA firm that works from QuickBooks.com, and you're using cloud services for Office 365, whatever you're doing, if you need to get to the internet to run your business, if that internet connection goes down, you're out of luck. You're out of business for the time period being until you can get those connections restored. So this eliminates a single point of failure on your network. So if you have multiple internet connections, it can take advantage of that. We always like to say, if you've got an M-Series appliance, if you've got a rack mount unit, there's no reason not to do a cluster, because we offer some very competitive promos on the cluster unit, on the HA unit, the high availability unit, that I'll talk about a little bit later when we do the licensing, when I cover the licensing and what needs to happen there. So to do clustering, there are two types of Fireclusters. The very first one is going to be an active-active cluster. This means both of the cluster members are sharing the traffic load. Now, this does improve your scalability, so you've got the ability to get more throughput than you would out of a single box. You're not going to quite double your throughput, but there is some overhead for the cluster communication. But basically, you're getting two sets of ports, two processors, two sets of RAM, everything to handle your internet traffic. So if you take the speed of one firewall and then add 90% of the speed for the second firewall, that gives you a good idea of the kind of throughput that you're going to get. This also has some load balancing options across the firewalls, and we'll talk about those as we get into them. But least connection or round robin, least connection says that whichever firewall is under the smallest load is going to handle the next connection request through it, or round robin just passes it back and forth between each one. Now, In order to do an active-active cluster, you have to have a couple of requirements. You've got to have at least one unused interface on the Firebox to use as a cluster interface. This is the communication between the two boxes to make sure that you're able to communicate back and forth, share the connection table, all of that. I do recommend having two because, again, we're doing this to eliminate single points of failure. If you've got just a single cluster interface between the two, you've gone back to a single point of failure. If that port were to fail on the firewall for some reason, you would want a secondary one to take over. A couple other requirements on an active-active cluster. The Firebox must be in mixed routing mode, can't do drop-in mode, can't do bridge mode. The external interface must have a static IP address. And if you're doing active-active on some of the lower-end units that have built-in wireless, the wireless must be disabled on the Firebox. We cannot do clustering with wireless enabled. Now, with an active-active cluster, I put it in bold, I underlined it, and I put it in italics. The number one problem that we see with people trying to set up active-active clusters is problems with their switches. And so switches and routers must be configured to route traffic with multicast MAC addresses. The reason for this is you've got two physical appliances and therefore two MAC addresses, but the network is trying to see it as a single IP address. So you will have some problems on your switching. 99.9% of any cluster failures that we see, if people are having trouble getting them set up and running, it's because they don't have their switches and routers, and this is either side of the box. Anything that is directly cabled to your firewall must support multicast. And in addition to that, depending on your switches, you might need to add static ARP entries, say that 5 times fast, to the Firebox so for each switch that is connecting to the boxes. So either side, inbound or outbound, if you've got a switch connected there or if you're connecting directly to the router, you've got to turn on multicast support, and that will be something you'll want to talk to your switch or router vendor about how to configure correctly. Now, the last piece of this, on an active-active cluster, subscription services must be activated for both cluster members. What this means is that if you're running the security bundle to give you web content filtering, gateway antivirus, intrusion prevention, all of the other pieces of the security bundle, if you're running an active-active cluster, you've got to license that full security bundle for both boxes. That's because both boxes are handling and routing traffic at any given time. So if you're doing an active-active cluster, it's much more expensive because you've got to buy a security bundle for both boxes, and your configuration gets much more complex. So typically I recommend for people, if you're going to do a cluster, I don't recommend the active-active cluster just because of the overhead of the licensing and the overhead of the configuration. It has a tendency to cause some problems. What I typically recommend people set up and do is an active-passive cluster. So this active-passive cluster is set up the same way, but it provides your hardware redundancy, but you only have one firewall handling the traffic at any time. So you've got a master and a backup master on the box. So when the master is active, it's handling all of the traffic. The backup master will monitor and sync status. If the master fails, the backup master becomes the master. So requirements on this, you don't have nearly as many. Firebox must have at least one unused interface. That's the cluster, and I recommend, again, like I said, 2. You can do mixed routing mode, or you can do drop-in mode on an active-passive cluster. The external interface still must have a static IP address, and any unused interfaces must be disabled on the firewall. So you'll notice we don't have any of the multicast things. We don't have any of the recommendations about adding static ARP entries. Active-passive cluster doesn't have those requirements. The other piece you're going to see is when you do an active-passive cluster, we set that up, and you only have to buy the security bundle, the security subscription, all of those pieces, gateway, antivirus, web blocker that you're familiar with, you only have to buy that on one box. And the 2 hardware boxes actually share the license between them so that you don't have to pay double for the security bundle. You only have to buy the full security bundle on your first box, and then we offer a promo right now for the high availability box that gives you about 50% discount on the price of the hardware for the second piece. So we've priced it very competitively. We would really like you to take advantage of this because we know the internet is vital to everybody's business these days. Connecting to the world is what you've got to do to get business done. So an active-passive cluster gives you the redundancy at a much better price point than an active-active cluster will do. So just requirements to do it. Just talk about things that have to be in play. You have to do it on a T30 or above. Both devices must be the same model and the same, excuse me, and the same firmware level. Both boxes must have an active support contract. The security bundle, the security licenses, you only need that on one for an active-passive, but they both have to have a static address. And again, the external interface has to be a static IP. Supported models, basically everything but the T10. The T10, the bottom end of our family line, does not support fire clustering, also doesn't support multi-WAN failover, those kind of things. That's designed to be a home box. If you're doing one of the wireless devices, 25, 26, and should have added 33W, those only support active-passive clusters. 21s, 22s, and 23s do not support clustering. And if you are doing virtual, these are only supported in VMware due to the nature of the switches that you can build in the VMware infrastructure, and it has to be an active-passive device. Okay, so what will trigger these boxes to fail over? First of all, there is a health index of each cluster. Each box, we will monitor everything from fan speed to voltage on the motherboard, power supply. All of that information gives you a health index on the box. If the cluster master index falls to a lower value, failover will occur. If we lose a heartbeat, there's a heartbeat between the boxes once a second. If you miss 3 or more heartbeats, that's configurable. It will fail over. Or you can do a manual failover if you want to pass the master roll over for maintenance purposes or something like that. When failure occurs, if you've got these boxes set up, and I'm talking mostly the active-passive here because if we're talking about a failover where one box takes over the connections for the other box. In active-passive, it's basically the same, but you're basically cutting your throughput in half at that point. That's another warning about the active-active cluster. Make sure you size your boxes big enough that if one goes down, the other box can handle all of your load. Otherwise, you're shooting yourself in the foot. So when a failure occurs, when we fail these boxes over, you're going to have a seamless failover on anybody that's using a packet filter rule to get out to the internet. Your branch off tunnels are going to fail over. Your users, if they've authenticated to the firewall for internet access, those are going to fail over seamlessly. If you are running proxy rules on the firewall, and I hope most of you are to give you the added benefit of the security services, your users will see a slight disruption in their proxies. They'll have to reset the connection. If they happen to be loading a web page right at the second we fail over, they might have to reload that web page. Now, a lot of the client-side stuff will take care of that. The client doesn't get a response from the server. It'll try again for a few seconds, and so it should be fairly seamless to your users. If you've got mobile user VPN going on, if the firebox does fail over, from the master to the backup master, your mobile users will lose their SSL or IPsec, PPTP, L2TP VPN connections. Now, the clients are smart enough that if they see a brief interruption, they're going to automatically try and reconnect. And unless you've got your firewall configured to force a reauthentication, again, it should be pretty seamless for your users. They should not see much of an interruption there. So when you're ready to set this up, and we'll get into the actual demo for this here in just 1 second, when you're ready to set up, make sure you've got everything ready to go. Your 2 firewalls must be activated. You must have gone through the quick setup wizard to get these going, to get the licenses applied to the boxes, and they need to be ready to go. Make sure the same version of fireware is installed on each box. You'll also want to have your feature key saved in a local file for each box. So when you register the firewall online, make sure you copy and paste that feature key into a text file and save that locally. You'll need to use that as part of the setup wizard for the cluster. So you will need a crossover cable for each cluster interface. I actually suggest using two crossover cables between the boxes so that you have a redundant connection. Now you will need a network switch for each enabled, trusted, optional, custom, or external interface, or VLANs will work as well. So you don't want your internal and external traffic running through the same VLAN or through the same switch. So I do recommend a switch on the outside and inside, or a VLAN in place. And then of course Ethernet cables to connect everything up here. So that is it for the slideshow. So let's actually build a cluster. One quick thing, I do want to just do a quick pitch for on our support website. I don't know if you guys have seen this now. If you go to the support website, you used to have to scroll down and get into the knowledge base before you would do a search for anything. We've now, and I hate to say it, in the past our search functionality on our website kind of sucked. To be brutally honest, it was a very poor search algorithm. They have now introduced this technical search, so as soon as you go to the support center, you're going to see that right at the top. And if I do a search in here real quick for Firecluster, this is going to actually improve. So I must have logged out and logged into my firewalls and done something there along the way. Wanted me to re-authenticate, but again, the search mechanism, they've completely redone the search engine on this. So when you do a search now, you're going to get results for everything. You're going to get some previews of the messages that were in here. You can limit it to everything that you want to look at. You can do documentation. It'll do the knowledge base, videos, other things showing examples. You know, if you're looking for something that might have a example config file, for example, you will see that in there. So the search function is quite a bit improved on our website, and I just wanted to point out, if you do want to go back and get this, do the search, look for this quick setup, this quick start, set up a Firecluster. This will get you into the online help that will go through and walk you through prerequisites, talk about how to plan it out, how to connect the hardware, what you need to do. So all of this information that I'm running through is available out online in our online help. So that's a quick plug for our new search on the portal. So we're looking at one of my other boxes here, a 505. So this box has some basic policies on it. This was one that I was using as my primary box before the M series came out. So to set up your Firecluster, there's a wizard that we can run through that's going to cover everything for you. And I do recommend using the wizard because it'll walk you through step by step, getting everything you need. So right off the bat, it's going to ask you, do you want active-active or active-passive? If you go active-active, how do you want to load balance? Least connection, which box is under the least load gets the newest connections, or round robin, they just trade off. Active-passive cluster is what I typically recommend. Now you are going to have to set a cluster ID. So this is a requirement for this. This will be something that you'll want to set. This can really be just a random number. There is a fairly uncommon bug out there, but I would hate to have you bit by it, that if you use cluster ID 1 every once in a long while, that can conflict with your default VLAN, your management VLAN ID of 1. So I recommend you change this to something other than 1 and use a number that doesn't match any of your other VLANs. So just for example, I'm going to plug in 33 here because I keep all of my VLANs at 10, 20, 30 at even numbers. So this way I know I'm not getting any conflicts with that. So as we run through this, first of all, it's going to ask you which of your cluster interfaces are going to be used for the communications. Now, these are the interfaces that you will use to pass communications back and forth between the boxes. So this is the ones that you are going to connect with the crossover cables. So I've already got my crossover cables connected. So I'm going to set this. I want to use my very last interface, interface 6, which is labeled optional 5 because we start counting at 0. And then my interface 5, optional 4, is going to be my backup cluster interface. The next thing it's going to ask for you is the interface for the management IP address. So this is where you connect to the box. This is typically the address that your clients will use as the default gateway. This is where you do management of the cluster from. So I'm going to manage this from my trusted interface. That's what connects back into my network. So first thing it's going to ask for is the feature key for this box. And since I've already activated it and got this box up and running, you see my 505 in here. I've got the serial number. I've got the license here. If I needed to import it, that's where you would have it in the feature, in the text file, and bring that in. So it's going to ask you to name these boxes. You'll need unique names on those. You can leave it at member 1 if you want. It really doesn't matter. These are just names. I like to give them names that reflect the models. So 505-1. Now the cluster interface IP addresses, these are the two interfaces that are going to have a crossover cable between them. You want to give these a unique subnet that is different than anything else on your network. As a personal preference, I will use 1.1.1.1 and /24. And then on the secondary, again, another unique subnet, so 2.2.2.1/24. This is not going to communicate with anything else on your network. This is just going to be these two cluster interfaces connected via crossover cable that are just talking to each other. So on my primary box, I use 1s. On my secondary box, I'll use 2s, and I'll show you that here in a second. So your management IP address, this is the address that you would use in case you need to connect directly to a cluster member. The cluster as a whole is managed through the primary internal IP of the firewall. So in this case, it's going to be 10.1.1.1. If I need to connect just to member 505-1 and need to do maintenance on this box, for example, this is the address that I would use to connect directly to the box as opposed to connecting to the cluster. So I'm just going to do something else other than 1 because that's my primary IP. I like to do it just at .5/24, and I'll use .6 for my secondary box. So it gives me the option, do I want to add another member of the Firecluster, yes or no? I can say no, and it'll do the configuration and be ready to go, and then I can add my box in later. If you're doing the cluster, you've got both boxes ready, go ahead and add in the second device. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Now, to get the second device ready to be discovered, there is one piece that you've got to do. And if I jump back over here to my help, and we'll look at this, let me collapse these out real quick. Make the second cluster member discoverable. You've got to go through, you've got to do the quick setup wizard, you've got to get the box activated, it needs to be ready to go. Once you do that, you must reset the second box to factory default settings, and it gives you the procedures to do that in here. I've got a box that has an LCD screen, so I hold the down arrow and turn the box on, and it's ready to go. But it's got those instructions. So the box has been activated, the box has been run through the quick setup wizard. When you're adding it to the cluster, reset it into factory default mode so that it can be discovered by the primary master. Now again, it wants me to import the key for the second box. So I'm just going to browse real quick to where I've got my feature keys saved for this particular box, and this is my 505-2. There's my feature key. I've got that in as part of the wizard. It's going to ask me for a name on this, 505-2. You can call them Bob and Tom, whatever you want. The names really don't matter as long as it identifies the firewalls for you. Now, this is the other side of that cluster interface, that crossover cable. So for this first address, it's going to be 1.1.1.2/24, since I have to have unique addresses on both sides. And this one's going to be my all 2s/24 management IP address. So this is the address if I need to, sorry, wrong subnet. If I need to connect directly to this box without connecting to the cluster, an address assigned to this box uniquely. So this should be a static IP address that is on your main subnet where your management interface sits. So I've got those addresses assigned. It's got the information going, and I click Next. Now, I like to check the box here because there's a couple of things we'll want to look at once we've gone through the wizard, and we can say Finish. Now, at this point, my cluster is not active because I'm working in the Policy Manager. Again, this is an offline editor. So it gives me a chance to go through, double check my settings, and see if there's anything else that I need to look at. So again, Firecluster properties, active passive, active active, interface settings, my two cluster interfaces, the interface for my management. Then the last section down here is the monitor link. So this is keeping track of any interface that is not disabled, and if it sees that that interface goes down on one of the two boxes, it will trigger a failover event. So if I had multiple DMZs or other things connected here, other interfaces turned on, they would show up in these lists, and I do recommend, monitor that, because if the link goes down on one box, it'll fail over where the other box has an active link. The next tab here is going to give me my Firecluster members. I can go through, look at the details of licensing, see that everything's ready to go, configure feature, just make sure, eyeball it real quick. Now on the Advanced tab, there's a couple of things that I recommend that you turn on. First of all, there's a checkbox. By default, we don't monitor hardware status, so you'll want to monitor the hardware in case you need to trigger a failover event. The other thing that I do recommend is do a notification. If you get a failover event for some reason, if you've got a sick box, you want to get an email so that you know that it's failed over. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK here. I've monitored the hardware status. I'm going to say OK. At this point, my changes are ready to be committed. I can go ahead and hit Save to Firebox, and I want to point out real quick, right now it's just showing a single Firebox here, and here it's just a single one here. Once I save this, and let's go ahead and hit the save, enter my admin password, save my config file, and I'm going to replace it and override it. It's going to go out and check. It's going to upload the configuration here, and it was saved successfully. Now I do have a ping running in the background, so this is a continuous ping. You will see a short interruption disconnection as you configure the cluster. It's got to set these up. The boxes in some cases might reboot, they might not. But typically you will see a short interruption. So if you're doing these setup, you're typically doing these off hours anyway. So just be aware of that. There will be a slight interruption in your connection. So now we'll give it a second for these to save off. This will come back and tell me it's connected successfully here in a minute. This guy as well. So at this point, we're just waiting for it to catch up to what I'm doing. And there you see we lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about a dozen pings, give or take, before it's coming back online. Now I just reconnected on my box. You'll notice this has changed it to a cluster now. You'll see the cluster here. I still, because I'm active passive, I just see one set of interfaces being shown here, but you'll notice my Ethernet 5 and 6 are now active as a cluster interface. Those are sending and receiving packets back and forth, and my ping is here running. If I come back to my system manager, this one still hasn't quite reconnected, and we'll give that one a second to catch up with us. Or we can just force it, disconnect, and then reconnect here. And you'll notice once this guy gets connected up, I've got a cluster. Cluster is standing by. Let me make this actually a little bit smaller so we can see what's happening in the background with my ping as well. I've got 505-1 is my master. 505-2 is my backup master. So 505-1 is handling any traffic for this firewall. 505-2 is just sitting waiting. It's loaded a connection table across. It's keeping track of what the first one is doing. Now, we talked about failover. If something happens, if we pulled an interface, I could walk over and disconnect an Ethernet cable. That would trigger a failover on these boxes. If your fans failed or your processor fried, anything like that, we would see that information in here and we would trigger a failover. The other thing we can do is we can actually come into our Firebox System Manager that's showing us the status of these, and we can come into Tools, and under our cluster, we've got several several tools that we can use. You can connect to an individual member as opposed to connecting to the cluster. You'll notice when I connected to the cluster here, I connected to the primary address. If I do that when I've connected to the primary address, 10.10.1.1.1, any change I make is going to be reflected across both boxes. If I were to come in here into the Policy Manager and do an upgrade, you'll notice when I put in my password, it's going to ask which version I want, and it will then ask here on the, I'm going to say no because I don't want to continue through this wizard and disconnect us, but it'll actually upgrade both cluster members. It'll upgrade your backup master, get it up to the current firmware version, and then do a failover event, and it will upgrade the first master they had failed over from, get both boxes, and then bring everything back up online. So all of your management is done through the primary address. You manage them just like you would a normal box at this point. So with that said, I want to show you actually what happens under here. So you can fail over the master manually. You can reboot an individual member. You can shut down an individual member. But let's actually do a failover. And I want you to pay attention to what's happening with my ping over here in the background when I do the failover. And we'll tell this we want to do a failover. It is going to ask for your password. Right now, my 505-1 is my primary master. We'll say OK here. It's going to trigger the interface and then pay attention to our ping here. And you'll notice because I was turning on notifications, I got a notification. Let me get that out of the way. Now notice these firewalls failed over pretty seamlessly. We're running several pings a second to this. We lost a single ping going on the failover event. So in most cases, your users are never going to know that anything failed over. I did get a notification because I turned that on that we've initiated a cluster failover. The reason, failover by admin command. If it was a health reason, if it was an interface down, it'll tell you that information as well. The second alert that I got was telling me that the 505-1, 505-2 takes over master role from the previous master, 505-1. If I come back here, you'll see that 505-2 is now the master, 505-1 is the backup master. So we can fail these over back and forth to our heart's delight, but it's a great way if the internet is important for you guys. If you need to have an always-on connection, you want to avoid the hardware failures, avoid the single point of failure, Firecluster is the way to go. It's a great solution. It works very well. There you see I just failed over it again. We lost a single ping, and that was it. The boxes stayed up. If you had VPN tunnels running, pings across those, you would see you don't lose any connection on your VPN tunnels. It's a great way, especially if you're doing active-passive, it's very economical to eliminate that single point of failure at the edge of your network. With that, we've run a little bit over time on our webinar, but I want to just make sure that if you guys do have any questions, please make sure you enter them in the question box. If there's anything that I didn't cover, I will make sure I back that up with an email back to you. If you guys do have any questions on how to do this, or if you want the reference, again, make sure you go out to our help. There's a great quick start guide that will walk you through this. And with that, I will turn everything back over to Elaine. Thank you guys very much for your attendance today.